Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. My name is Priscilla, and I'm on the marketing team here at Samsara. And on the line with me is Brian. He's on our customer success training team.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be back.
Our training today will focus on how to reduce fuel costs with Samsara. If you were able to join us last month for the Samsara Quarterly, you might remember that we talked about driver efficiency and the new features that would be helpful in that area for your fleet. But today, Brian will dive more deeply into those features with a live dashboard walkthrough. He'll also share a framework that can help you identify how to tackle fuel efficiency for your fleet. And we'll give you a couple examples of how other fleets have cut their fuel spend. And as always, we'll have a live Q&A at the end. After the training, you'll get a recording of the session in a follow-up email, and I'll also send out these slides to you so you have them. So if you're taking notes or something like that, just know that you'll have the recording and the slides. We also have our stellar support team on the line ready to answer your questions. You should see a Q&A box on your computer, just like what you're seeing on the screen here. So if you have a question, please type it in and just hit send. The team will answer everything that they can, and we'll follow up on anything we're unable to get to or help out with live during the webinar. I have 3 people on the line today helping answer your questions: Beth, Hannah, and Catherine. They will be taking care of you today. All right, to kick us off, Samsara has a mission of improving the efficiency, safety, and sustainability of the operations that power our economy. That's all of you guys. And for the past few years, we've been focused on driving innovation in the areas of real-time data, artificial intelligence, and open APIs. We have a very large team dedicated to research and development, and they read every single feedback submission that we get from you, whether it's from the dashboard itself or from our driver app or fleet app. So just keep sending those in to inspire the new features that we're creating. Today, we've grown to serve over 15,000 organizations worldwide across a variety of industries in both the public and private sectors. And we truly believe that this is a partnership. It's you and us. So on behalf of the Samsara team, I want to thank you for choosing Samsara and trusting us with your business. And as you know, feedback is super valuable to us. And since we're talking about fuel efficiency today, I want to kind of get a feel for where you guys are with that in your operation. So we're going to put a quick poll up. And the question is, do you currently have a fuel efficiency program? So let me make sure that this poll is visible to you. Okay, so you should see that on your screen now. Take a look, pick the option that best describes where you're at, and I'll give you some time to make your selection. Cool. Thanks so much for sharing. I'm actually going to share these results. So it looks like about 20% of us in here, yeah, we have a fuel efficiency program, but actually a large chunk do not, or they're not quite sure. So we're glad that you're here. We're excited to talk more about some of the ways that you can think about it and just some of the tools that you have at your disposal within your dashboard already. So I actually do have a follow-up question for you all. What is the biggest pain point that you're facing? Obviously, we're glad that you're here, you're interested in reducing fuel costs, but what is it that is the most frustrating part for you right now? All right. Let me share what you guys said. So this kind of makes sense, right? A lot of you guys don't have a fuel program right now. We're going to talk definitely today about figuring out how to get started. Brian has lots of good stuff for you. The second largest kind of pain point was, how do you coach drivers effectively? Followed by getting drivers to buy in, creating the right driver reward system, and then some of you guys want to make sure that you're able to get leadership to buy in as well. So I hope that you don't feel so alone in some of the frustrations and challenges that you're facing. You've got lots of people who are right in the trenches with you, and we're glad that you're here today because we can talk through some of what we're seeing that other fleets are able to do, and of course, the tools that you have in Samsara itself. So I thought that as we dive into today's training, it would be interesting to share some research with you. So I did some reading, and one of the things that I found really interesting was that driver behavior accounts for 1/3 of the factors related to fuel usage. And I think this is actually really exciting and encouraging because it means that once you're able to understand how to coach drivers effectively, once they adjust their behavior, it can make a really, really big impact on your fuel economy. And that's great news. Second, I found that a study by Argonne National Laboratory found that an idling truck consumes about a gallon of fuel per every hour that it idles. Seems like a lot. I'm imagining like a whole thing of the gallon of milk of fuel just kind of going poof after 1 hour of idling. And researchers estimate that more than 6 billion gallons of fuel is wasted each year due to idling. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity to reduce unnecessary fuel waste because that helps reduce the carbon emissions that are going into the air. And maybe most importantly for you guys, it saves money. So I'll turn it over to Brian now to go through some of the product features and program strategies that can help unlock those dollars for you, because we know that it goes directly back into your bottom line and will help your business. So take it away, Brian.
All right, thanks, Priscilla. Again, nice to be speaking with everyone today. It's morning, afternoon. I'm glad that you're able to join us and carve some time out of your day. It was good to see kind of some of the polling results we got. There were some questions around, how do I get started? How do I engage with drivers? That's exactly what we want to target during today's discussion. And what I have up on the screen right now is really just a framework to think about solving this problem. You could really apply it to any problem, and there are some tweaks you can make, but what we want to do in today's session is give you a way to think about tackling this problem and building projects around it. So we think about this as 3 major focus areas that we'll hit during today's presentation: analyze, adjust, and act. And I've got some bullets here, and you will have a copy of this for later. So if you miss anything, again, you will have a follow-up for this. But when we think of the analyze portion, it's when you're really getting your arms around the problem or problems you want to solve, and understanding, what do I know already? And what additional information do I need to know? And so we'll spend some time in the dashboard talking about gathering that information, and building a case for the work that you want to do. The next thing we'll talk about is the adjust portion. So you've done all of your analysis. What do we want to do with that? What plans do we want to make? What changes do we want to make? And then when we think about act, it's really easy to kind of combine adjust and act. I have a plan, and we're just going to execute the plan. But the execution can almost be the most difficult part. How do we get buy-in? The poll that we saw had a lot of questions around how do I engage my drivers? How do I incentivize my drivers? It's worth thinking of that as its own plan by itself. How do I get buy-in? How do I train my team? And then really in the last part of ACT, none of these projects really ever go away. None of this really ever ends. It's constantly iterative. So part of your ACT is thinking through what should I be analyzing now? What is the next step? How do I get better and better and better? So there'll be a theme across the entire presentation where we go through these steps of analyze, adjust, and act. So as we move to the analyze portion, I want to spend some time just walking you through the dashboard and giving you some visibility into the areas of the dashboard that'll really help you with the analyze portion of the discussion. So we'll spend some time in the fuel and energy report, the fuel purchase report, the if to mileage report, and we'll spend a lot of time in the driver efficiency report, both on the existing portion for the report, as well as the settings that you have availability, that you have access to. So I'll move over to the dashboard. And so here, we're in the fuel and energy report. Just to film, I realize everyone on the line is probably in different places in their familiarity with the dashboard. All of the fuel reporting we'll talk about will be over here in the fuel and energy section. So everything I kind of spelled out, we have over here in the left portion. So the fuel and energy report is a great way for you to see your vehicles and get basic statistics on their fuel economy. I went to this dashboard in particular. It might look a little bit different for yours, but the fuel and energy report really builds off of the makeup of your fleet. And so in this particular fleet, we have options to view specific vehicles, the miles per gallon efficiency, which really gives you a sense of how efficient this vehicle is in an aggregate, your entire fleet, fuel used, total distance driven. If you have carbon goals, there's carbon emissions provided, estimated costs are something that come as a flat average, US average for the entire fleet. We'll talk about how you can customize that. We have engine runtime, and then we have PTO, aux, and idle time. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the PTO aux later on in the presentation, but that can be a really large driver and a really difficult thing to get your arms around in terms of understanding when is PTO usage and idling beneficial to my business, and when is it something that I need to actually be cutting because I consider it wasteful. But this is a good ground level for you to understand what's going on in my fleet, which vehicles are contributing the most to my fuel spend, how much time am I spending in idle, how much am I spending in PTO, the emissions that I'm putting out into the air. Depending on what your goals are for your business, the fuel and energy report is a great dedicated place for you to pull that information. And beyond just having it listed in the report, I think anyone who spent some time in the reports understands that you have the same features you always have. So you can change the date range over here on the left for this report, and then you have the ability to schedule a dedicated emailed report to yourself, or just download the CSV. So the data is just sitting there for you to grab, and really it's about consuming it in the way that makes the most sense for your business. And again, we'll talk to PTO and a couple of these items a bit later. The next report that I want to talk through, we'll have it on a different tab, but it's the fuel and purchase report. Right now this slide is empty, but we'll talk about this in a bit. So the fuel purchase report allows you to pull in or upload information from your fuel purchases, and it relies on either a CSV upload or an integration to a fuel card. So you'll see if I land on this page, I can go to add fuel purchase report. And what this allows you to do for a couple of select vendors is upload a CSV. And then once you've uploaded that, you can basically have the direct consumption of fuel as well as the cost for that fuel directly in your dashboard. So as I mentioned on the previous report, that report was really built off of the data we're pulling in automatically from your vehicles combined with an expected flat rate for fuel costs. But if you want to get down to specifically what your fleet is spending based on the miles that you are driving, the fuel and purchase report is made to be a really easy way for you to grab that information. So again, we're just doing the analysis phase. We're figuring out how do we understand the problem, how do we grab the data that's most relevant to us. And as you can see, there are a number of links here to help you kind of go through the details of that CSV or that fuel card integration. But again, something you want to be aware of as you're starting to tackle this problem. We'll be more strategic a bit later on in the presentation. So we'll cancel out of here. And as we move over to fuel, the next part we'll go to is if to mileage. So we'll go to if to mileage, and the reporting portion for if to mileage might not be required for everyone on the line, but what it allows you to do is understand your distance driven for each of your vehicles across states. We also do breakdowns across all of your vehicles and all of your drivers. And the intent here is, as part of your overall reporting strategy, much more related to IFTA specifically, is being able to report the miles driven for your vehicles for your tax purposes. I wanted to call this out here because not only can it be somewhat helpful in helping you understand where your vehicles are operating and where that kind of fuel and that time might be going, but there's also some really useful features in terms of just reporting. So up here in the top right, I mentioned in the previous report, you had scheduled emails. I'll click into scheduled emails, particular for IFTA reporting. As you scroll down, you can put in a specific report name, you can add in filters, but I want to draw everyone's attention to is for your reporting period, we have daily, weekly, monthly, and then specific to IFTA, we have quarterly. And so for those of you on the line who part of their day-to-day is just pulling together all of your IFTA information, yes, you can set up timeframes in the dashboard, you can export CSVs, you can you can kind of store those for your records later, but you can also set up quarterly reporting. So you can see right here, we have the timeframes for the quarterly grabs. So if part of your role for people on this line is just pulling all that information together and having it in one place, this is a really great way for you to just have that data sent to you only when you need it, only when it's relevant for you. So I want to make sure, even if it was just kind of tangential to gathering fuel data, that you're aware it's here, because I assume the use cases overlap for those of you on the line. And then the last part that I want to draw attention to, and we'll do this in two sections, we'll start with the report itself, is driver efficiency. And this is a newer report. So we'll just load up here. So the driver efficiency report works a lot like the safety score if you spent some time on the safety portion of the dashboard. What this does is takes a number of components that lead to efficient or inefficient fuel consumption and gives an overall score to your drivers and an overall score to your fleet. Just to orient you with the page, just like on the safety page, we have the underlying performance information here. So how often is cruise control engaged, operating within a green band, anticipation, etc. And there are definitions for all of these that I'll show you in a bit. But what you're able to do here is on a driver or vehicle basis, we'll leave it a driver for now, you're able to look over time, what's impacting my fleet the most? You know, what are my scores for the various issues that I'm looking for? So if I'm looking for how often overspeed is an impact on my score, cruise control, and maybe idling, I have a trend that shows me what that impact is to my overall score. Where are my best scores? Where are my lowest scores? That's all normalized against the amount of driving time and the amount of engine time. And then down below, you can see for each one of those features, I actually have a score for my drivers. So I can understand for my drivers, where is the largest impact? Where is the waste? What should I be dialing in on? Again, we're not talking so much about the solutions in this portion, but we're talking about gathering the data. So how do I get my arms around it? So I think between the items that we've discussed so far, and this is probably by far the most detailed and most impactful for you to understand, where should I be digging in? Where can I kind of get more information to understand, you know, where the efficiencies are to be gained across my fleet? So that's kind of the analysis phase, and I purposely kept it at a high level because everyone is really at a different place. But I definitely encourage, if you have questions, thoughts, things like that, the support team is on the line to help you out there. So please feel free to toss those in, and we'll make sure we have time at the end to answer any questions as well. But I do want to keep reminding people that there are resources while I keep going. So we've kind of gone through the analysis portion. I've kind of given you some sense of where to go to actually gather the information. Now it's the adjustments. What adjustments do I want to make? What changes can I make? What plans can I start forming to see the results that I'm hoping to see? So for the adjustments portion, we're going to hit the settings portion of the dashboard. So we'll start in settings. We'll talk about how you can customize that driver efficiency report. So where I just came from. We'll also talk about updating fuel costs, another portion for the fuel cards, as well as some alerts and documents to consider as you think through what adjustments can I make as I'm working with other stakeholders, my drivers, etc. So keying that up, we'll head back into the dashboard, and I'll move over to my next tab. So I've moved over to the settings portion of the dashboard. So you have it here in the gear icon, and I've already scrolled down to fuel and energy. So we'll spend some time here talking about some of the things that you have control over. So that previous report that we had earlier that had the score for your overall fleet as well as your drivers, you have the same areas of concern and reporting here. So you have your cruise control, your coasting, those are all outlined here. And what you can see is by default, in your settings, these are all kind of equally weighted. But everyone's fleet is different. Everyone has different concerns. And this is where you actually start making the adjustments to catch what you find to be most impactful. So if your fleet has an idling, if you believe your fleet has an idling problem, or idling is something where based on your analysis, you think that's what we want to target. We see way more idling in our fleet than we do against our peers. What we hear is best practice. We really want to drill in on idling. So what you can do here is you can go into configure, and we'll let this queue up in a second. So within idling, I can then go in and I can change the weighting here. So I can go and say, rather than equally weighting these, I think idling is a lot more impactful to my fleet than anywhere else. I'm not going to save on this organization, but this is how I'd go and make this change here. The way that I would think about this, and really all changes when I think about making programmatic changes and adjustments, is iterative. I mentioned earlier, we go through those various roles of analyze, adjust, and act in an iterative fashion. I would do these one at a time. So if you decide that idling is what you want to tackle first, just move the idling portion. Set that, leave the system be, monitor it for a week, a month, a quarter, whatever makes the most sense for the change that you want to implement, and see what that does to your overall score. Once you've got the handling on idling and it's where you need it to be, maybe overspeed is the next issue. Maybe drivers are breaking a threshold that you think is not only bad for fuel economy, but perhaps unsafe as well. Make that the next score against driver efficiency. And just kind of iterate through, but then save those as you're kind of moving, kind of ratcheting up and getting closer to what is ultimately ideal. So again, I'm keeping it purposely general for everyone on the line, but you have each one of these levers to kind of manage your fuel economy and really dial in what makes sense for you. Over time, your score will fall as you target things that you think you're weak at, but then it'll rise over time. So expect that kind of constant fluctuation and constant iteration, and keep your eye on your miles per gallon or your total fuel cost, because those should be coming down as you start targeting the areas that you feel need the most attention. So I'll cancel this really quickly and we'll back out. So that's how I can change the weighting between the different efficiency options. The last part that I want to mention on this page is actually setting the bands. So Basically, what you can see here is there's a low score and there's a high score region for each area. If we stick to idling as a scenario, what we're saying is anything above 50% idling gets the lowest idling score possible. Anything below 2% is the best kind of idling. 2%, 1%, anything below 2 is seen as really good. And so anything below that gets the highest possible score, and anything above 50% gets the lowest possible score. That's the band that I'm considering. As you're adjusting your weighting, I would also recommend changing what you consider your low and higher band. Maybe for your industry, you're expecting that, based on how my vehicles operate, there's always going to be maybe 10% idling. You can go in and configure. For idling, you can say 10%. I'm always expecting 10%. My drivers, my team, my crews, they're operating as they're expected at 10%. So that's what I want it to be. They shouldn't be penalized for 5% idling, because that's what I want them to do. That's what their job requires them to do. So an advanced setting on top of moving the toggle is actually setting your bands. What is good and what is bad, and anything beyond there is kind of outside the bounds. So those are two ways that we can configure our driver efficiency score. And again, definitely send in those questions if you have thoughts or concerns, or just want to know more about how that works. As I move on to fuel cost is very straightforward. So we talked a bit about being able to upload the fuel purchase report information right on the report. This is a way to go in and just change the flat rate in the back end of the system. So I mentioned earlier with that estimated fuel cost is a flat rate that comes in by default. It's kind of the national average. It's applied to everyone equally. But obviously, lots of fleets don't operate at the same purchase dollars per gallon as the national average. And even the national average moves very often. So what the fuel cost portion within settings in fuel and energy allows you to do is set that rate for yourself. So just take the total fuel consumption for your fleet and the total fuel spend that you've had over a given period of time. Maybe it's annual, maybe it's quarterly, and you can set your blended fuel rate for your fleet. What that means is going forward, you will see that estimated cost applied to all of your vehicles across the Samsara dashboard. So it's a really easy way for you to say, well, that dollars per gallon doesn't really reflect what my fleet's seeing. I'm going to put in my own flat value and have that apply. Another plus to being able to do it this way is you have this custom fuel cost history. This allows you to see when you've made changes. So I mentioned that you might want to grab your annual spend over a given amount of time, but maybe your work is seasonal. And so instead of doing it annually, you do it every quarter or whatever the season dictates. You can also have a history of when you've made that change. So depending on how the mix of your fleet changes, maybe you've bought all new vehicles, and so that's going to change things. Or maybe you moved into a new region of the country, so that's going to change your mix. Whatever it ends up being, you'll have a time-stamped history of every time you've changed your dollars per gallon spend for your fleet. So you want to be able to understand how the numbers have changed, and a big factor will be, if you're using this, what you've updated it to. The last portion that I want to go through in settings is just the fuel cards. And this is really more of a reminder from last time. It's the same idea I walked through before. If you want to get started with a fuel card integration, we have both kind of a way for you to kind of learn more information, as well as just get started here. So again, if your vendor supports this integration, this is a great way for you to just jump in and get started. And again, the benefit is the same as I mentioned on the fuel purchase report. You're getting the direct values of the fuel consumed and the dollar spend. So if this is available to you, if there's interest, I definitely investigate getting it set up. And again, if you have questions, just feel free to ask. But I do want to call out that it's there for you to take advantage of, because it's a really great way for you to update what you're currently using with the system and implement it as part of the ACT portion that we'll get to in a bit later. So we talked about some of the reports that are available. We've gone through the settings that you can make adjustments to. What I want to move on to now, outside of settings, is really understanding what can I do from a documents perspective. So I will back up here. And so first, I'm going to move up down to documents, and we'll cover alerts after this. So the documents feature is one where, if you're not aware of it, allows any of your drivers who are utilizing the Samsara driver app to send feedback and paperless information back to the fleet. They allow you to centralize that information in a paperless format. It's directly from the app to your dashboard. There are a lot of applications, but one that we see a lot of good traction with is fuel purchases. So I'm going to go over to documents. You can create your own documents. Up at the top right, you can see I can create documents, but I can also go to the standard available documents and make updates and edits. So if I go down to fuel receipt, I can go in and edit. and you can see what's already available in terms of expected information. So in the current fuel receipt, by default, it's looking for a photo of the receipt, it's looking for a total cost, it's looking for the fuel amount purchased, as well as a reference number, which might be some code that comes in on the receipt itself. Any driver with your org can see this document and can submit this information, which then lives in the document section of your dashboard. What you can also do is require some of these. So maybe you decide that you definitely want your driver to be entering all this information, but most important is the picture. I need to have a picture of that receipt. You can make this required, and the form can't be completed without a picture being sent up. So in terms of the program you might want to implement, part of it might be not only do I want my drivers to obviously make purchases to continue their work, but I want them to send me a form that confirms what they've paid for it, making kind of my back end, my team more efficient, that kind of thing. You can make that required here. And then one level further that you might want to make as part of adjustment is additional fields. So if we scroll down here, we talked through the first four, but I have multiple choice options. So maybe I want to keep track of which fueling stations my my drivers went to. Maybe we have networks that we operate in, so it's in network versus out of network. Maybe there's certain stations that we work with more closely. You can make that a multiple choice that you want to collect. You can also add date, time, and you can add signature. And this really adds a lot of ownership. So if you add a signature to it, the driver has to type in their name and sign their signature to each one of these. So these are all ways in which you can formalize a collection of your information if it helps influence your fuel purchase decisions. And then I will back out here really quickly. We'll cancel that. We're not going to make any changes right now. That's the documents portion. Definitely another thing you might want to implement to kind of involve your drivers in the process. And then the last part that I'll talk through in terms of adjustments before we move on to ACT is the alerts portion. So in the alerts portion, we won't spend a whole lot of time. We talk about alerts in a couple of presentations, but I want to talk through a couple of alerts that would be really helpful in kind of managing your fuel costs and something you might want to implement when we get to the ACT portion. So as we think through available fuel alerts, there are two that I want to draw attention to. So the first is the vehicle engine idle. We talked about this on the very first report. So you might decide, and we'll discover this in our ACT portion, this might be a great way for you to start implementing that change. We had a lot of responses that said, I'm not quite sure how to work with my drivers, how to think about coaching, that kind of thing. The vehicle engine idle report, idle alert, is very straightforward. It basically looks for scenarios where the vehicle is idling and you're able to set a time frame. So I might say, given the scenario I made earlier, my fleet, I expect some amount of idling, but never really more than 15 minutes. Any more than 15 minutes, I want to be notified. In my role, I need to know, and I want to talk to the driver about that. I want to understand what's going on. And if it becomes a policy across the entire fleet, then that's something you can enforce. And with the power of alerts, you can not only have it set for all of your vehicles, maybe it's something regional. So if I have tags set up to talk to a certain region of my vehicles, I could do it based on tags, and then I can send it to that regional manager. So the tags are a really flexible way for you to catch idling exactly when it's happening and notify the appropriate person. If there's someone in particular, maybe your fleet's to the size where you want to have an alert per driver, you could do that as well and let them know, like, hey, you're idling, your vehicle is unattended, go back and correct that issue for whatever it might be. So this alert's a really easy way for you to catch idling just by setting up an alert, which will automatically look for that behavior. The other alert that I wanted to make available or just make you aware of is the vehicle fuel level. So the vehicle fuel level does a couple of things. One is more focused on just being aware of where the fuel level is for kind of keeping things topped off. And the other one is more for theft prevention. So vehicle fuel level by default lets you alert whenever the fuel level falls below a certain percent. This might be something where the vehicles have to be ready to go, at the start of the day. You never want someone to return a vehicle without topping it off for the next person. So you might set up an alert that says, if I notice that a vehicle is below 20% or whatever it might be for a certain amount of time, maybe it's for a number of hours, so between shifts, someone should be notified to come back, top up that vehicle, so when someone needs it in the morning or the next shift, that work's been done. So that's super straightforward, but more on the fleet management piece. On the anti-theft side, you might say, well, I want to know when there's a large decrease in the fuel level of my vehicle. And this would be something on the lines of, well, if I see that there's a 50% decrease in the amount of fuel within my vehicle in a 10-minute span, I know that's not typical operation. I know that's not the vehicle operating as expected, and that's something that I want to invest in. So we won't spend, this is probably the one scenario, the entire presentation where we talk about theft. But again, if fuel costs are something you're getting your arms around, something you want to kind of check off to make sure everything's going the way it's supposed to, the fuel level alert is a great way for you to catch this behavior as well. So we covered a lot of stuff across both the analysis and the adjust portion. I'm going to head back into the presentation, and we're going to talk through a couple of actions that you can take, a couple of things that we can kind of share in terms of both best practices, how do I get a project up and going, as well as some examples from some of our customers. So let me advance the slide here. All right, so it's time to act. How do we think about making change? So we're going to cover a couple of peer examples. First, we'll talk about productive versus unproductive idling, which I alluded to earlier on in the presentation when looking at PTO and auxiliary installs. The next we'll talk about is just coaching drivers on idling. And then the last piece is on implementing bonus programs. And given kind of the pull response we got around working with drivers, hopefully these will be insightful for everyone. So the first part we'll talk about is just distinguishing productive versus unproductive idling. So in this portion, it's really thinking critically about what does my fleet need to operate effectively? What has to happen? In the picture here, you see an example where across this fleet, their vehicles do a number of operations that require energy, require fuel consumption, but are not involved in driving, not involved in actually moving the vehicle. And so you've got to take that into account. It's not simple enough to just simply look at idling, because idling won't capture these. So what the Samsara system allows you to do is perform auxiliary installs that will catch this kind of behavior. So in this case, for street sweeping, we're keeping track of when the broom is down is in operation. This claw is cleaning up debris. We can keep track of when the claw is actually being utilized. In this way, when you start looking at auxiliary and idling consumption, you can start pulling out the auxiliary portion. So it's a really useful thing to be able to do. If I scroll down through the presentation here, you can see I can head right back to the fuel and energy report. So I had that earlier on the dashboard, and you can see that these items are pulled out separately. So because you have insight into both of these with the auxiliary import, it's really easy for you to rely on this one dedicated report and know that the idle time really is just idle time. The PTO aux time is business critical time. We have to clean streets. We have to remove debris. We have to mix cement. We're an ambulance company. We have to keep the lights going in an emergency. Whatever it may be, you want to make sure that you can kind of keep track of those scenarios where fuel is being consumed for a business need and not being lumped in idling. So the auxiliary install, auxiliary report information is really useful for that. Another added bonus towards tracking auxiliary data is the aux information can also be overlaid on the dashboard overview map screen. So what I have here, I wasn't able to demo it live in the presentation, but what you can see in the graph here is I'm on a vehicle detail view for a specific vehicle, and the red line shows me all the times that the aux is in place. And so just from this view, if I know this fleet, I have a really good understanding of when this should be engaged and when it shouldn't be engaged. And so not only do I have a time perspective to understand how long it's happening, but I can also understand where it's happening. And for the scenario for the street sweeper, I know for my vehicles where they should actually be cleaning on a given day, what the schedule is. And if they're leaving the brooms down, if they're running them longer than they're supposed to, I can catch that in this visual view. So this was one thing where the city of Fort Lauderdale was able to use this functionality to do exactly that. Just one way to implement that, one implementation was to utilize aux to catch this extra behavior. In the next scenario is the Dorn Transfer Company. So it's really exciting to share some of these results directly, and I know we have item material we'll share with you, but a 50% reduction in idling. So they were to be able to do this simply by implementing an idling program along the lines of what we talked about in the alert. So a 2% increase in fuel efficiency across the entire fleet, roughly 150,000 gallons of fuel saved, and $500,000 in savings per year just by implementing an idling program based off of a 7-minute rule. So, how are they able to do that, and how can you do it yourself? You want to monitor the trends. So the fuel and energy report that we went through earlier, that's a great resource for you to see that information. And the driver efficiency report really allows you to drill in on the graded performance across all of your drivers. You can then identify the changes that you want to make to decrease idling, and then you can actually roll up this new policy. As I mentioned, for the Dorn specific case, the policy was really just around 7 minutes. Everyone's decision will be different. You'll have different time frames, again, for your business. But once you decide what the rule is, and a rule like 7 minutes of idling is a really easy thing to understand. So It's an easy thing to get your arms around. It's an easy thing to implement. And with the alerting functionality, it's a very easy thing to just track, set, and forget. And across that, you can see really big success for really small changes and really small asks of everyone in aggregate. So before I move on, I do want to talk a bit through, how do we think about the process overall? So it can be helpful to work backwards to figure out how do we get to those gains that we saw for door and transfer. So the first thing is think about, what do I actually want to save? So is it a percentage change? Do we want to improve our miles per gallon by 2%? Is it a dollar savings change? If I have a given budget for what I can spend in a year, is the need to save that budget amount? Is it a behavioral change? Do we have policies? Maybe we have policies we couldn't enforce earlier. So maybe the idea was per company policy, idling should be under some amount, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever it may be. And it's just out of control. We're not seeing the results. Think about what you want the visible outward goal to be, because that'll be the message that you share with everyone else. That'll be the report that goes out to everyone to show if we're on track or if we're behind. As you're moving towards those goals, think about a couple of things. If you're setting these goals, are they attainable? Do I think that I have the bandwidth or the ability to reach every driver to let them know about idling? Do I think the budget goals are attainable? Really be really concrete and really realistic about what you want to do. And then, what kind of plan do I have? Can I actually attain those goals? So they're possible. Do I have the resources that I need? So you really want to think through what's my end objective and can I get there? Do I have a path to success? And the way that I often think about it in terms of getting that goal is, what is my overall impact? Where's my end state? What do I want to do? And it fits into that percentage MPG, total dollar save, change in behavior across my drivers. And you can decide what that impact is. Don't hold me too closely on the math here. It's not simple as straight multiplication, but I wanted to make a simple diagram to share. But what's my current performance? I've done the analysis to understand where I am. What's my baseline performance? What are the adjustments that I want to make? What are the suggestions that I want to actually implement? Do I need to institute a fuel card program? And we're going to go based on that. Will I have a document program where drivers will send in and sign off on their fuel purchases or rely on alerts? And then the success of adoption. It can't be overstated. How do I bring people along? How do I make sure that when I communicate the alerts that we want to implement, or do I want to communicate the dashboard that we're going to share, that everyone's bought in? Because that really all ties into the available impact, the goals that I want to set. So once you've got a good sense of all of these, you can clearly and concisely describe what your goals are and what your impact's going to be. Just one more example before we close up is for GP Transco. So a 4.5% increase in miles per gallon. So they were able to do this with a coaching program. So in just 5 months, they were to see this big improvement, 205,000 gallons of fuel saved in 2020, and over 350,000 in savings per year. The route that they went was an incentive program. So how can you go about doing something similar like this? Again, decide how you're going to track the behavior. Which reports allow you to get to that? Driver efficiency, to me, again, seems like a great way for you to get your arms around that kind of behavior. Determine the incentives that are available to you. This will be different between fleet. I've seen all kinds of examples. I've seen PTO offerings, I've seen bonuses, I've seen trips. There are all kinds of ways. It's really understanding, what's most valuable to you. I've even seen company swag sometimes, especially if you think about how limited it is, just basic company swag where people can tell, that person is on top of it. This program that we get regular updates on and that we celebrate our heroes for hitting their goals, I want to be like that person. All of those things are fair game. It's really just thinking through for your scenario, what are my options? Specific to GP Transco, they basically took the top 50 drivers and paid them additional 1 cent per mile. And they share that information with the entire fleet every 10 days. So it's a very visible way to see who's on top and clearly reward people for being so. So I just wanted to kind of share a couple examples. Again, we've got a broad audience. Everyone's in different places, but hopefully that number of people who weren't sure about where to get started, weren't sure about how to kind of have the discussion, get things going, have learned a bit more or benefited from kind of what we've gone through today. And with that, I'll give it back to Priscilla.
Thanks, Brian. I know we went through a lot of information. Just a quick recap. The main takeaway that I think you guys can all walk away with is this framework of analyze, adjust, and act. It's a way to structure how you think about reducing fuel costs. You want to make sure you're capturing all the data you need so you can really dig in. Brian talked a little bit about capturing that PTO and auxiliary. Make sure that you have the correct installation so that that information is pulling into your dashboard. After you have all that data, Samsara has a variety of tools and reports that you can configure to match your fleet's goals and priorities. So I've been seeing a bunch of questions coming in about configuring different aspects. That's awesome. Keep those coming. And last but not least, my favorite part, figuring out what actions that you can take with your fleet. I hope that you were inspired by what other fleets have done, and maybe you have some ideas bouncing around your head for what you can do for your operation. So we're really glad that you're taking the time to think about this. As a quick call out, Brian mentioned fleet card integrations at the beginning of this training, and I just want to highlight that again. If you use Fuelman or Comdata fuel cards, you can pull those purchases into Samsara automatically, and this will help you manage all of your fuel spend in one place. You'll have the ability to correlate GPS data with fuel purchases, and that helps reduce fuel fraud. So having all this information in your dashboard is a really great addition to your fuel efficiency reporting. Now, I've also seen a bunch of questions coming in about different kinds of cards or having like different partnerships with different kind of like fuel chains and stuff like that. We're always adding more integrations. So if you don't see it right now, there's a good chance that we're in talks with different groups to add that in. But I do want to call out that you always have the ability to upload a CSV of fuel purchases. So if you can't get that integration, make sure that you look at the CSV bulk upload, and that can definitely give you your fuel purchase information into your dashboard. Okay. No, we've gone through a lot of information. You guys have been submitting a ton of questions. So a big thank you again to our support team who have been answering these live on chat. But now we're going to move into our live Q&A portion of the presentation. Again, I've been taking a look at your questions and pulling out some themes. So let's start off with this one. How do I know if I'm setting the correct fuel economy targets for my fleet?
Yeah, so I think the best way to think about that is thinking through benchmarks. So there are a couple of things that you can do. There's a lot of publicly available data simply on miles per gallon for the vehicles that you purchase. So like there's typically a rating with the vehicle that you have. So I think miles per gallon is a great way to get started. Understanding with the vehicles that you have, the routes that you run, the size of your fleet, what's a good MPG target. I think that's a great way to get started in thinking about, what is the expected performance for my vehicles and what am I seeing? And combining that with what you'll see in the fuel and energy report or the driver efficiency report lets you get a sense of, are you ahead? Are you behind? Are you in the range that is expected for the fleet mix that you have? Vintage also plays a part. If it turns out that some of your vehicles are behind, you can dig in on what that ends up being and build that initial target. So you can say, well, I should be expecting something on the order of 7 miles per gallon. I'm seeing something closer to 6 for my entire fleet or for this division. That's the first place to consider setting a target. So you realize that you could be closer to the spec or you could be closer to the rest of your industry. I know that a lot of our customers, stay close with each other. There are a lot of tight-knit groups. Ask favorable members of your partner organizations, things like that. What are you seeing? What are your best practices? It's really a discussion to figure out where should you be, how do they make their gains, and then set your targets to be in line with those gains. So I think miles per gallon is a great place to get started if you have no higher level guidance on budget requirements or anything else like that.
Cool. I'm seeing kind of a theme popping up of, asking about the custom rate for how much fuel costs. Sometimes I think customers have a bunch of different kinds of vehicles, so they're asking, hey, is there a way to input multiple costs, maybe one for gasoline and one for diesel, or what do you think about that, Brian?
Yeah, so there are really 2 ways to go about entering the cost information. So for the settings page portion I showed you about fuel costs, that cost value is across the board for your fleet. And the way that I would think about that is, and this is really, this is kind of the high level general information, then there's like a drill down we can do. At a high level, what you can end up doing is you'll want to look at the overall fleet. So you'll have probably light duty vehicles, heavy duty vehicles. They operate on different shifts. They probably have different vintages. Really, to kind of get started, you want to look at it as one overall blended rate. It won't give you the exact information on every vehicle, but if you know the types of vehicles that you have and the amount of miles they run, the blended rate is a great way for you to start tackling an overall macro problem. What are our fleet's costs? What are the overall fleet impact? What you can then do though within that is you still have the option of breaking things out into tags. The tags themselves won't update the cost, but they will allow you to drill in and see that information on a specific view for the area that's impacted. And you can drill in, you can say, well, I like my macro number, the blended rate is my entire fleet, but when I drill into my heavy duty vehicles, I know that things are a little bit different and I incentivize those differently. I kind of aware of them because I'm aware of kind of how my fleet breaks up across those timeframes. So that's kind of how I'd handle that at an overall level, a combination of tags and understanding that I have a macro view of my overall fleet spend. What I would say also is we shared the fuel card information a couple times. That would be the best way to have a dialed in specific value for fuel consumption against fuel costs for each specific vehicle. So at a high level, the blended rate really does apply to everything, and tags can help you break things off to understand how close or far they may be. But the fuel card integration would be the closest way for you to get a very specific one-to-one of what are my costs, what are my fuel consumption outputs per vehicle.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, I think this is going after the 1/3, factors related to driver behavior. Question is, how can I understand if my drivers are taking the most efficient route to a location? Sometimes the least amount of miles might not be the most efficient. So they're asking, I think, for some advice on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that I was thinking through, and we didn't spend too much time on here. We spent a lot of time today talking about specifically the fuels, specific items within the dashboard, so fuel settings, fuel and energy, and documents and alerts specific to fuel. There's also the routing portion of your dashboard, and the routing portion of your dashboard has a couple of things that I think can help with this. It's on the left portion of your dashboard, right near fuel and energy. Within routes and dispatch, you have both recurring routes and you have the plan versus actual report. The recurring routes allows you to analyze the routes that you have recurring within the system. Everyone on the line might not be utilizing routes, but what the system will do is it'll set up an expected route to a given location, but it'll also then show you kind of the performance of that route over time. So you can start to understand, especially if different drivers are taking that route, which drivers are being really efficient with that route and which drivers are being inefficient with the best way to complete that route. The other portion that I mentioned is plan versus actual. And the plan versus actual just gives you a very high level visual view that you can drill into of here's the expected time and mileage it would have taken to reach a certain destination across an entire route, and here's what actually happened. And it gives you a different view of very similar information. You have a plan, here's what I expected, here's what I'm seeing. And what I've seen a lot of success with different fleets doing is just working with their drivers to understand what's successful. The plan versus actual and the recurring routes can be a really helpful way for you to engage your drivers and say, one level above the incentivizing and rewarding people for having good fuel economy is also making them champions who can talk to their fellow employees, fellow drivers about what works for them. So like when I run this certain route, here's how I do this. Here's where I decide to do my refueling. Here's how I avoid traffic, whatever it may be. You can turn kind of your best performers into advocates about how everyone can be good performers. And so these reports are a really great way to not only understand just the general fuel economy of how I'm driving a certain road, but how I'm getting somewhere in the most efficient way. So I would definitely recommend checking out the routing portion of your dashboard and investigating kind of the plan versus actual and recurring routes reports, because it'll give you that extra level of information about where I should be going, how to navigate certain portions of my fleet's route or my fleet's coverage area. Great question.
Yeah. Similarly to figuring out like what drivers are doing on the road, I think we're getting some questions on best practices to implement. How do you roll some of this stuff out, right? When we put up that equation, the projected impact, there's so many components, and one of them is the efficacy of rolling out this new program. So do you have any advice for folks who might be starting to get into this for the first time and maybe being a little bit intimidated by that portion at the very end?
Yeah. So I think the way that we kind of presented the way that I presented that slide was very much a kind of straightforward pseudo math, kind of here are your three components and this drives your impact. But when I think about implementing change or implementing a project, that last portion about the effective rollout is really the most important portion. You can have, the best baseline numbers, you can have the best plans, but really implementing change is about working with people. And people want to be heard, they want to feel part of the process, and they want to understand. And so when I think about implementing any kind of change across the fleet, changing any kind of behavior, it's about communication, making sure people feel involved and having buy-in and being consistent. So whatever change you're going for, whatever you want to change, you're asking people to trust you to implement a new policy, to have the company's best interest in mind when you make that change. So when you say you're going to do something, you've got to follow up exactly how you said you do it, exactly when you said you do it, and you need to be consistent. So if you're going to implement, we'll go back to the alerts example. I'm going to implement a program that says, if I see idling over 10 minutes, I make the follow-up coaching action. So I call the driver directly, or it appears, or it's a discussion we have later, whatever it is. You've got to be accurate 100% of the time. Whatever new policy you implement, you've got to stick to it. If it's rewards, the rewards always have to go out on time and always be consistent. If you decide to change the policy, you've got to be really clear about the change that you've made. And then you've got to show consistent performance. So not only are you kind of consistently doing what you said you do, but you're making regular report outs. It kind of pulls in the GP portion. They regularly show the leaderboard to their drivers. And so people can see the change. They have faith in the tracking system. They have faith in the project. They have agreement on the goals, and they see the goals are being rewarded and moving the overall fleet in the right direction. So maybe to summarize all that into a very bite-sized answer to the question, it's really about consistency. It's being transparent, and it's about being consistent.
Yeah, for sure. I know we can talk a lot about techniques and how to implement and how to create strategies that are going to really work for your fleet. I want to make sure that we wrap up in time because I know everybody has a busy day to get back to. So I know that you guys hear us talk about feedback a lot, and our training webinars are no exception. We would really love your feedback on this webinar. So anyone on the line with a smart device, please take a moment, grab that device, open up the camera app, and hold it up to this QR code. A link will pop up on your screen, and I'll leave the slide here so you can access that. So go ahead and fill out our feedback survey right now. I promise it'll be really quick. While you're doing that, I have a couple announcements for you. So if you submitted a question via chat and you haven't received a response yet, please don't worry. We'll follow up with you regarding your question after a webinar. And I'll just want to remind you guys that we'll be sending out an email later today with a couple of resources. So I know people are asking about that. You'll get a recording of today's training. You'll also get a PDF handout of the slides that we just went through. And now you might have noticed that there are a couple webinars coming up. On the previous slide with Mark Your Calendar, we have a special event on September 17th called Inside Look. And this one in particular is going to be really, really cool because if you enjoyed hearing us talk about the city of Fort Lauderdale and Dorn and GP Transco today, I just want to let you know that our recent Top Fleet Award winners will be on a panel sharing their own insider tips for how to leverage Samsara to drive next level efficiency and safety. So GP Transco will be there along with ArcBest, Sprint Waste Services, and Athens Clark County. The registration link for this I'll send out in that follow-up email. So if that's something that is interesting to you or you would like to receive a recording of that, make sure that you register to save your spot. After that, in October, we'll be doing the next Samsara Quarterly. Like I talked about earlier in the webinar, that is a webinar where we go over all of the new releases and new features that have come out in the past couple months. So we did one back in July. We're going to do one at the end of October. So if you want a way to really easily get the highlight reel of all the different things that have come out in your dashboard, I would encourage you to attend that. So we don't have a registration link quite yet, but mark your calendar, save that date, and keep your eye out for a future email with the registration link. That's kind of it from us today. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I would love to see you guys again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.